Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome inside the Guilty as Charged podcast, coming to you live on a Wednesday. We are officially 1 week away from the start of training camp. Rookies are already in the building. Veterans report on Monday. So excited to have all of that coming back so I can stop talking about dumb shit like Lakers versus Warriors. But it's all good. My name is Steven. I'm your host. Joining me are my guys Tyler and Alex. Alex, we just got news of the James Harden extension. So how you doing?
We already knew he was coming back, but yeah, we need football season. I can't keep debating the Warriors and Lakers on Twitter, please. I hate both of these teams.
Yeah, I mean, at least we're not that dude on First Take just throwing shit out and seeing what sticks to the wall. So it is what it is. More Ringer and Athletic, less ESPN will be very beneficial for everybody's mental health. I'm just saying that right now.
Shit,
Tyler's here as well, man. Tyler,
I wish I was Mad Dog Russo. I could see what sticks to the wall every day. He gets like $10,000 an episode. Shit, I wish I could do that, Mad Dog Russo.
Very true, very true. I think the rest of us though consume more Ringer and Athletic, and I think that'll be very beneficial for our mental health. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm doing very well. A week away from training camp. I have all my training camp tickets acquired. I guess we just get them through Ticketmaster. And I can't wait to be there. I'll be there for all but I think 3 days of training camp. So I'll try my best to, have some sort of good coverage for you guys. We're basically down to like one beat reporter and like me. So, I'll do my best to try to cover the team. Follow me on social media, follow me on Twitter. I'll try to get something out there for you guys.
Yeah, it's gonna be Daniel Popper and Tyler, and then random fan videos every now and then. So definitely follow Tyler. I'm still working out whether I'll be able to go to anything this year. Our house has kind of hit a bit of a snag, so we'll see if it's how that's doing and whether or not I'm able to get training camp tickets. So in terms of training camp, how do the joint practices work? Because I know they're like exclusively for season ticket holders, but are they really? Or
it's tough because last year they advertised the scrimmage as being just for season ticket holders, and it was kind of like that for a while. Then suddenly they just opened it up to fans. Granted, that was at SoFi Stadium. This is just going to be at the at the facility. So
yeah,
I assume it is just for fans. It's like a fan or a season ticket holder, plus like one person. So I could bring 4 people, I guess. But yeah, we'll see. I don't know exactly how that works. I don't know if they're going to change things the last minute like they did last year.
Well, I know I've messaged a few Cowboys fans that I talked to on social media, and they're all super annoyed that they don't get to go down there. So I guess that's kind of a good thing that they're all just planning to hang out in Oxnard for a few days, or I don't know what they're doing, but hopefully it should be better than last year where against the Niners when it was like 90% Niners fans and like 99.9% Niners beat writers.
That's right. I remember last year when all the Niners beat writers were like just a bunch of them covering the team wonderfully and doing such a great job in videos and hearing what they hear on the field and talking about it. And our guys were just kind of like, never mind. But
yeah, our best coverage of the scrimmage was Tyler and Arjun at a car. Just like you couldn't even hear anything they were saying because it was so windy, but that was our best coverage.
Oh my goodness. Kevin Kernick pointed out that he tried to get his training camp tickets a week ago, but Ticketmaster was down. So I would definitely go check that. I was looking at it yesterday. I was able to access them. Again, wasn't able to purchase any just yet, but we'll figure that out. If you think Niners beat reporters are the worst, wait until you see the Cowboys ones. It's going to be a crazy mess down there, at least in terms of press. So we'll see. All right, so today we have a fun show planned for you guys. We're going to talk about underrated storylines and underrated Chargers players ahead of training camp, ahead of the season. Obviously, both are classified, and then later on this week, we're going to dive fully into the position battles that we're most excited to see unfold throughout training camp. So let's start with Alex here. Alex, what is one underrated storyline that you are paying attention to this season or in training camp?
I'd say in training camp, it's mostly the defensive line, I think, is the underrated one. Whether it's underrated or overrated, I don't know. We don't have many Chargers beat reporters covering the team, so I think everything is kind of undercovered. But at the same time, it's just like they brought in so many new guys. You have Sebastian Joseph Day and you have Austin Johnson. It's going to look like a very different group than what we've been accustomed to the last few years, which has just been like Jerry Tillery, Justin Jones, Linval Joseph, right? So, Tillery's still going to be here. In what capacity, though, we don't really know at this point whether he's going to be a starter, whether Morgan Fox will supplant him. And so they really have, I would say, 3 completely, new starters in Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, and Morgan Fox. You add in Otito Ogbonia, who's a new player. That's 4 guaranteed roster spots at DT. And then you're looking at Jerry Tillery, who, I would count as a guaranteed roster spot at this point. And then you have probably 5 guys who are competing for 1 spot, or are they even going to keep a 6 DT at that point, or will they just roll with 5? So I think that's going to be the most interesting one heading into training camp, just because of how much uncertainty there is. I think largely we know who the other players on the roster are going to be, but that group, I think, has the most flexibility to it and could be changed by the outcomes of preseason reps, by the outcomes of training camp reps. It's kind of hard to, really get into the trenches, I think, in training camp, but at the same time, I'm just very curious to see how that group looks out the gate, because it'll be very important that they look much better than they did last year. And I think, how can they kind of win within the margins, and, which guys does Staley and the defensive line coaching staff view as being important through at least the first bit of training camp here. That's a storyline that I think requires following most, in addition to saying, whether Tillery is a starter or not.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about just like roster construction and what to do for Tillery versus Fox, and like individually what do these players bring. But it is, I'm very curious to see what this training camp battle really presents. Is it really a training camp battle, or do we already know who the 5 are? Because I think you can pretty much guarantee that Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Jerry Tillery, Morgan Fox, and Otito Ogbonia make the roster. And if they only keep 5, that's the 5. Like, that's it. And, I don't think you can really cut Otito Ogbonia and expect him to be on the practice squad. So unless you are bumping that up to 6, like, we already know who the 5 are. Every spot is spoken for. And I know that there's been a lot of frustration about Jerry Tillery, and I totally get that. I totally share that. But if you cut Jerry Tillery, Morgan Fox is your only pass rusher. And as much as I think Sebastian Joseph Day will be improved in that regard, like, I think you need 2 legitimate pass rushers. And last year we saw them try and have that kind of construction with Justin Jones and Jerry Tillery, in my opinion. So it is just going to be really just curious in general how this plays out. Excited to see what Fehoko, Covington, Forrest Merrill, and that group all kind of look at, and what exactly do they have to do to earn a roster spot.
Yeah, there's so many juicy storylines out of this. I don't know if I'd consider the defensive line in general like an underrated storyline, but there's so many things I could like branch off of and find from there. And I just want to see if this team has learned from their mistakes from last year when it came to the interior defensive line. Like, do they keep 6 players? Like, it was desperately obvious, and they absolutely needed 6 guys out there. They ended up going with 5, and that cost them significantly. And then they kept the wrong 5 guys, and they interchanged in and out. Like, so, are the position battles even worth it? The guys that did earn their spot last year didn't make the team. Is that worth it? So I'll definitely be watching that. And then when it comes to, I was surprised, given what they did at training camp, how their stunt rate wasn't really all that different from what the Rams did in 2020. And sure, I'm sure some of that's injuries, personnel, whatever, but it felt like most every day in practice, every other rep was some sort of stunt. Like, there were times, Fehoko was going up against Rashawn Slater because they twist, stunt, whatever, loop. And I was just surprised by how often they were doing it. And when they got to the regular season, I didn't really see it all that much. They did a fair amount for sure, but not as much as I expected, given what they did in training camp. So there's definitely a lot here for sure.
I was just responding to the question about Donald Parham, who is 100% cleared to go medically, so he'll be fine. It was definitely interesting. I've been watching the defensive line mostly, and I went back and watched the Chicago Bears with Khalil Mack. And I mean, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but it definitely felt like the Bears and that front were doing and running stunts a lot more than the Chargers were. And, Brandon Staley talked last year about how, the lack of success on first and second down was really limiting them in terms of like the designer looks, as he calls them, that they were able to run. And so maybe that was also applicable to stunts and games that they run along the defensive line. But I think whenever they did them, they were so successful, right? You put Joey Bosa on the interior, put him next to Uchenna and Woso, you do some kind of twist, or you do some kind of twist with him and Jerry Tillery, or Drew Tranquil, even, who I think is somebody that I think I'm really excited about when it comes to rushing the passer this year. So that's definitely an area that I think they need to increase, do it more frequently. And listen, man, like I think there are so many possibilities for pressure packages when you kick Joey Bosa inside. You have Kyle Van Noy or Chris Rumpf, and then Khalil Mack on the opposite side. And I think that kind of personnel package is just going to be, wonderful this year to watch. But they have to do it more. And I think down the stretch of the season, they finally started to realize, like, hey, Joey can really kick some guards' ass. Like this needs to happen more often. And it worked. So I think that's a great point to point out, Tyler.
Yep. Alrighty, I'll get into my underrated storyline, which, boy, did I go way more underrated than I think you guys might be going. My underrated storyline is, will special teams dominate practice time in training camp? Which sounds like such a ridiculous thing. If you weren't there, you don't understand. If you told me that the actual practice, like not talking stretching, was an hour long, honestly, it felt like 45 minutes of that went to special teams, and maybe 3 minutes of that went to Justin Herbert and the starting offense. And it's no wonder that the offense didn't really have everything installed all the way. There were the illegal shifts, the drops. They didn't prioritize offense and Justin Herbert in training camp. And the flip side, you have defense. And we talked about a little bit before the show. Things are different now. Last year, they were trying out 3 different kickers, and they all kind of sucked. And they had 6 different returners, and they went with the wrong one. And new special teams coach. And they do have that again this year, but things are a lot more defined. So does special teams dominate practice time this year? Again, it seems like it's ridiculous, but I really do feel like them putting that much time into special teams last year really cost them, especially when some of the guys that they were featuring on special teams during that practice time didn't end up making the team. So it almost felt like it was worthless, and it really did, I think, hinder the offense. So does Staley allow that to happen again this year with someone like Ficken, who's going to have to come in, install his new scheme, put in these new players? Is that going to happen again? Or does that kind of take maybe a 50-50 split this year? Because, boy, if you went down to watch one of those practices, you basically were watching special teams, and that was not that exciting.
Yeah, the first practice that I went to was a lot of like 7-on-7, and it was a lot of 11-on-11 stuff, which was great. Those, if you go back on my timeline from back then, that was a lot of the explosive plays that I was showing, a lot of the position drills that I was doing. But then the second day, man, it was like literally 60% special team stuff. And it's so funny, like looking back, and I interviewed Jeff Miller of the LA Times, like leading up to the first game against Washington. And like all the beat reporters were like so praiseworthy of what Brandon Staley and Darius Swinton were doing, because they were like, oh, they looked at this special teams unit as a disaster, and they'd spent a ton of time trying to perfect that unit. And then it not only did the special teams not improve, like Tyler's pointing out, it had some other adverse effects as well, where you're talking about an offense that really needed those reps and needed that practice time. So I have a special teams thing here as well. And really, is it just like how much can this unit improve with all of the specialist spots settled, right? Because last year, not only did you have the kicker battle, I mean, Cole Mazza got hurt, I think, after the 3rd week of training camp. And so then that's when they brought in Matt Overton. So then they had another change. They flipped returners at each spot. The only constant through last season was Ty Long. And this year, I feel like every spot pretty much is set in stone. I mean, Dustin Hopkins has competition, but not really. I mean, he's signed to a multi-year deal. DeAndre Carter theoretically has competition, but not really, based off of what they've said and how he's been used and things like that. So I think special teams has really gone from a sore subject over the last couple of years to now we're just kind of waiting for them to see really how much they can improve.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's almost improved just because everything is settled, right? And we were talking about this in the group chat earlier today. It's like, well, you still have to see him get through like 4 games first before all concern is thrown to the side. But at the same time, it's like we know Dustin Hopkins is an NFL kicker, and last year we were trying out 2 guys who really weren't NFL kickers. Badgley in some ways has proved himself, but not really. This guy, never was that guy. Tai Long never really had any competition, but we also never really believed in him as like this great punter. And then the less that is said about the returner position last year, the better. So I think the fact that you have DeAndre Carter and you know what role you want to use him in, that's great. And obviously was a hand-selected guy by Ryan Ficken. And the fact that you have Dustin Hopkins going into year 2 really on this team, which is in a way kind of his year 1 because he was brought in, mid-season last year. He's up to date on everything special teams. I don't know if they'll spend as much time on it, and I don't know how much it'll really end up impacting the offense, but based on the fact that they already have these positions kind of figured out and there's not really any battles, then, I think that should just kind of, lighten the load for the special teams usage in training camp. But of course, we'll see what happens as it goes on. I guess I'm most curious to just see how many special teams drills they end up running more so. We've heard about like Jalen Guyton at the gunner position, for example, in addition to Keemon Hall and like some of the other guys that have been working there. So I'm more curious to see that stuff on special teams and how that's going to be orchestrated. But I don't think they'll spend as much time on the real positions of special teams because I think they've kind of figured that out already and have shifted the personnel from what was, the previous Lynn personnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of an extension here. I haven't like really gone out of my way to watch special teams, but on Game Pass, you always see kind of like the back end of the kickoff returns or kickoffs. And man, Nick Niemann is always flying around and making plays. And I think, we kind of were waiting to see somebody fill that Drew Tranquil, Derek Watt void from 2018. And, Nick Niemann, I think, is more than capable in that regard. So he's potentially on the roster bubble. We'll see how that works out as a pure linebacker. But I'm hopeful that he's able to kind of become that special teams ace that the team has been missing for a while. What's up, Tyler?
Sorry, I was responding to a comment. Thank you, Austin, for saying nice things about us. I was responding to him. My bad. Listen, I almost put Nick Niemann in there for our discussion later about underrated Chargers, and I suppose he is because of his role in special teams. I would love to see him get more snaps somewhere. You have this very talented, seems to be pretty good guy who's earned his role on special teams sort of player. You want to see him take that next step forward. So maybe in year 3, hey, maybe he's Drew Tranquil's replacement or Troy Reader's replacement, whatever. But I don't know. Maybe they won't get that opportunity this year.
Maybe I would love to see more Nick Niemann snaps on defense in 2022. Yeah, 2022. All right, so I think the point that I want to go to next that I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts on, because we've talked a lot about Austin Ekeler being a little bit disrespected over the past couple weeks. He was 8th, I think, in Madden ratings, but the Madden ratings in general are just a shit show. Jamar Chase 15th, Max Crosby out of the top 10 is just like, what are we doing? But I do think there is a world in which Austin Ekeler kind of regresses a little bit, and particularly in the touchdown making category, because he's not going to get 20 touchdowns this year. It's just not who he is as a player on a regular basis, I think. So, one of the areas that I really want to see them evolve, of course, is the running game by extension. But where do they kind of make up the ground if and when Austin Ekeler kind of regresses a little bit this year as a runner, and specifically, his production in the red zone, I think is something that's not really talked about a lot on social media.
Yeah, I get that. I think he's an absolute monster when it comes to that angle route that they have in the red zone every once in a while, even out of their own end zone or into the end zone. That was kind of my next storyline too, is talking about the running back room. And I want to know what they're doing with the running backs in general, but with Isaiah Spiller, and whether they do actually use him as that slot receiver, that wide receiver, as that motion guy that he was in college. I think, talked about it when they drafted him. They did one of 2 players, in my opinion, an elite athlete or a receiving back. And I think Spiller, he's beyond a receiving back, but he is a guy who can actually catch the football and be a guy who can work outside, work in the slot. And I want to see what he can do there.
Yeah, Steven talks about Austin Eckler's, production progressing, and I think in general for the Chargers, if they can find ways to replace that, that should be a good thing, right? Because
Sure.
you shouldn't have to use Eckler at the usage rates that they're using Eckler, right? And we saw Eckler, unfortunately, last year get hurt towards the end of the last year, and he, publicly complained about, hey, everyone else behind me sucks. Can you not suck so then I can be healthy? Like that
Yeah.
was really how the end of 2021 went. And so I think that in that way, you want to see guys like Spiller, supplant to the RB2 role. So then we don't have to worry too much about Kelly and Roundtree. I was going to bring up more of a macro point about the running game, actually, which is what kind of, playbook do the Chargers run? What kind of designs do they have, even for players that aren't exclusively running backs? We talked about Xander Horvath a lot on this show. Is he a guy that, is going to replace Gabe Neighbors? Can you use him in some run play designs? DeAndre Carter had 10 rushing attempts last year for 90 yards. Can you use him on some packages? Much like Chargers fans have been kind of like begging the team to use end arounds at times. So I'll be curious to see run play designs. Obviously, I don't think in training camp the Chargers are going to like really open up the playbook and show that to the public. But if it gives us at least some kind of indication that they're, working on some of these things, even with players that are outside the running back room, inside the running back room, I'll just be curious to see what kind of, run packages they want to run offensively. We've talked about the running to the left versus running to the right thing, if that's kind of fixed with this new offensive line, or if that's still going to be kind of the focus with, Slater and Filer on that side. So I think that'll be interesting. But in general, yeah, I do think wanting to see Spiller, Roundtree, and Kelly step up, in lieu of Austin Eckler, so that they can, finally kind of like bring his usage down a little bit. Obviously, still the undisputed RB1 of this team, but they just need to have guys step up behind him. Or frankly, this offense, in some ways, may falter towards the end of the season, like it did in spots last year.
Yeah, I need to see how they generate some sort of. Again, you can't really see this in training camp, but how are you generating these explosive plays that people are going to hate me for it, but it's true. And if you look at the numbers, unfortunately, Austin Eckler isn't like an explosive big play sort of guy. And that's fine. That's completely fine. He's excellent with so many other things, but he's not the home run hitter. He had one play over exactly at 40 yards last year and none past that. And that wasn't until week 17 against the Broncos, where basically everyone left him isolated on a screen to the left. And it's like, I think he had one run of 28 yards, and that was his longest run of the year. Like, how are they generating more explosive plays, like Alex said, out of the backfield, whether it's a running back or DeAndre Carter or Xander Horvath? How are they trying to get something more explosive? I suppose that's just better blocking. I suppose that's drafting Zion Johnson. I suppose that's just drafting Isaiah Spiller. But I'm curious how they'll integrate that, and in particular with Carter. I just talked about them wasting time last year on special teams with certain players. Austin Prohl was really involved with their offense and on special teams. And then he got hurt a little bit and they cut him and there was just nothing there anymore. But Joe Lombardi did they were looking for a yak and they were really trying to get him involved in that. So is that Carter's role this year? And I want to know, is he involved at all with the ones? Like, how much do they use him with the ones, if at all? Or is he just really heavily involved with the twos, which should suggest that he will get some action on game days? Because they do need to justify him being on the team over Andre Roberts. And I really would love to see them try to get him on the field in those situations with the ones. Maybe it's one hand off of practice. I don't know. It's just something to get him involved on offense.
Yeah. And I think, kind of going back to something that Kevin Kernick pointed out in the chat, and this is kind of an extension of what you're saying, like the pony package, meaning when you have two running backs on the field or two people in the backfield alongside Herbert, was such a staple in New Orleans over the last few years with Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara, Latavius Murray and Alvin Kamara. And the Chargers didn't really get to do a whole lot of that last year. They would do it from time to time with other players. They put Steven Anderson in the backfield, or they would put Keenan Allen in the backfield, or Andre Roberts or Jalen Guyton. But they never really trusted a second running back until kind of the back end of the season with Justin Jackson to really kind of execute these packages. And I think it just gives you more options, more personnel packages that you can kind of unleash when you have Eckler and Isaiah Spiller, or Eckler and DeAndre Carter, that you can kind of motion out and then just attack different mismatches in different ways. and I think this will be a super crucial part there. And getting back to Alex's point, just like schematically, the Chargers really didn't have a full-on like identity in terms of the run game really until like week 7 or 8, in my opinion. Because if you watch the first 6 games, it's like a lot. It's kind of a mixed match of outside zone, inside zone, and gap schemes or counters. And then really in the second half of the season, they really lean heavily into the outside zone stuff, the counter plays, lead pull, whatever you want to call them. And it worked. It worked really well for them. And Arjun pointed out today, the Chargers rushing attack in outside zone was one of the best in the league, specifically to the left side, of course. So I'm just curious to see how that changes with Brendan Nugent, if at all. Does it go kind of really all in on the zone and counter stuff, or do they still try and figure out if they're more of a gap scheme, zone scheme? Curious to see just how much experimentation happens there with a new offensive line coach.
Yes.
All right. Alex, did you have another underrated storyline that you wanted to mention?
I don't know if this is an underrated storyline, but just going into training camp, how much fool's gold is there? Tyler mentioned Austin Prohl last year, and we sort of talked about him as like, oh, is he wide receiver 6? Is he, is he effectively the new returner? And then pretty sure it kind of due to injury partially, but he ended up being in the first round of cuts. I think last year. Obviously, there's the infamous Tyron Johnson, scenario. What's less said about that, the better. So I'm curious to see, I guess, how much the coaching staff values some of those big plays that are shown to the public in training camp, some of those moments where guys just contribute. Obviously, we won't know who like these guys making big splash plays in training camp are until we get to training camp. But, I think you could, make the case that, just because you see a tweet of someone, catching a long pass or making a big return doesn't necessarily mean that like that changed the eyes of the coaching staff, I guess. So I'm curious to see, and I guess a little bit more skeptical this year of when you see kind of a breakout candidate or someone who's having a really good practice, how much the coaching staff values that. Xander Horvath makes a big play. Does that mean he's taken the lead over someone like Gabe Neighbors, or does the coaching staff still value Neighbors, for example? Right. So I'll be curious to see, I guess, how much the Chargers want to show, in these public practices, and also how much they value, I guess, what they're showing and how much they value player success individually in these practices as well.
Was there anybody last year who actually won a job based on their training camp performances in the preseason? I mean, Steven Anderson was a surprise. I don't know if they always had the intention of making him their fullback or not.
I guess
I would say Steven
Forrest Merrill getting on the final roster, but then he was demoted back to
cut.
Well, then he got cut immediately, but he made the final roster.
That's true. That is true. I would say Steven Anderson and then Eamon Ogbongbemiga would be like
there
ones
you go.
who kind of won that battle or their respective battles, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, there's 1-ish and a half.
And I guess Storm to an extent.
Yeah. They really kept 3 tackles?
No, they kept 4 because of Brian Bulaga.
Or 4.
Bulaga got hurt, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Question.
And then after Bulaga got hurt, they replaced him with Schofield.
Gotcha. Question from LA Chargers fan: RB trio of Eckler, Spiller, and Horvath stash Kelly or Roundtree on the practice squad opens up a spot to keep an extra player at a different position.
My thing with Horvath is that I think he's better suited as a hybrid player, not necessarily like a pure running back.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a big difference between Horvath's skill set and even Kelly and Roundtree, who are kind of, lesser running backs. I think are better pure runners than Horvath would be.
Yeah, someone let me know what Horvath's yards per attempt in college was. I'm pretty sure it was like 3.5. So I wouldn't get super ahead of ourselves here that he's an excellent running back and should be RB3.
Yeah, I think they view Horvath and Neighbors pretty specifically as fullbacks. I mean, obviously both of them can contribute, in the offense when they're asked to, but also they didn't ask Neighbors to do much last year and had him as a healthy scratch pretty frequently throughout the season. So I don't know if that means like a real increased role for either him or Horvath, whoever wins that fullback job. I would love to cut down on a running back. Unfortunately, I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to keep 4 again, and I think we already know it's going to be Eckler, Spiller, Kelly, and Roundtree. Love to see Kevin Marks or Lenny Browner in a spot, but I think we're pretty set on the 4 heading into training camp and in the preseason.
Yeah, a couple people asking about which roster spot could be an undrafted free agent. I think that if there's any this year, it would be a running back, in my opinion. And I would have said maybe Stone Smart or one of the other tight ends, but Stone has some kind of injury. We don't really know what. He was placed on the NFL I list yesterday, showed up to training camp on a scooter and in a boot. So some kind of foot injury, not sure what's going on there, but whatever it is, hope he is able to recover as soon as possible.
Yeah, really unfortunate. That was kind of the guy that I felt like was taking a little bit of a, not about front runner, but certainly on the rise. And now is there even a chance at this point? I don't know. It depends on the severity.
Yeah. Of course, got a shout out Tyler's parents, both of them in the chat today, and dropping some big super chats as always. Tyler, any other underrated storyline that was on your mind before today's show?
Sure. Are the drops still happening? Is this still a thing? Because that was pretty early on in camp last year. Herbert was 9th in drop rate. He led the NFL in drops last year. Does that continue? Is that still a thing? Have they figured that out? Is it apparent to us? And I'm sure the drops will increase a bit, or the rate should increase in games because there's contested whatnot. But like, is it a problem in camp? I hope not, because even early last year, we could see that Mike Williams was struggling with drops, and hopefully things are just a little better this year, because as even Jalen Guyton had some drops last year. Like, I hope we're sort of past that, or it's not really noticeable in a bad way.
Yeah, I think it'll improve at least somewhat with Jared Cook being gone, right? But I think specifically with the receivers, right? Like Keenan Allen very uncharacteristically had a lot of drops last year. Although the second half of the season, he really honed that in. Mike Williams had a bit of a problem pretty much the whole season, though. So not a whole lot of chatter about that recently. Everybody was really frustrated about it during the season, but it's definitely something that's got to change this year.
I'll be curious, I guess, in addition to what we just branched off with the undrafted free agents, and I do still think Kevin Marks and Lenny Brown is probably the best chance from a running back's perspective. But which early undrafted free agents the coaching staff favors? You have Tyreek Maddox Williams in the linebacker room. You have Trevon Bradford, a wide receiver. You have a couple guys just kind of like scattered throughout the roster. Shelby at edge. I remember we sort of talked about him, and that was kind of one of Tyler's favorite guys as well. So I'll be curious to see which early undrafted free agents have a leg up. Again, maybe that doesn't end up meaning anything because of some of the decisions we saw made towards the end of last training camp. But if you get some good momentum from training camp heading into those preseason games, could mean a lot for a guy like Eckler, like it did a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always one, right? Like there's always one undrafted free agent that we kind of don't necessarily predict that kind of has a big training camp and makes some noise. I don't think any of us would have expected Eamon Ogbongbemiga to make the roster, heading into training camp. So maybe it's, someone that we're not really talking about very much.
Like that Old Dominion receiver, isn't there? Or is that Stone?
That's Stone.
That's Stone.
Who's the other receiver that one of you guys talked about?
Bradford.
Sure.
He's the one from Oregon State.
Awesome. That guy.
There's a second one, though. There's a second undrafted free agent receiver, though, isn't there?
I can't remember. I think that is Smart, though, because he was listed as wide receiver, and then they put him at tight end, right? I don't
know.
I don't remember another wide receiver off the top of my head. Our lads, where are you?
I'm just looking up at the roster right now. Old Dominion center, maybe, Tyler. Isaac Weaver, Old Dominion center, maybe.
That wasn't the guy I had to cover. but
Well, I'm just thinking he was another Old Dominion player.
okay, gotcha.
Let's all remember
Sure.
the book reports we did 2 months ago.
Wait, where are the receivers at?
Sort of extension because we just talked about him. Does Ogbongbemiga even make the roster this year? I think he'll make it for the same reason he made it last year. Murray's not healthy. I think he'll still make it again.
Yeah, he could. Depends if Murray's healthy. I guess this is really a question about, do you buy the Ogbongbemiga hype train? Because obviously there's the reports that the coaching staff is really high on him. I guess I just view him as a fringe guy on the roster, and he'll make it if Kenneth Murray's hurt. If not, I guess this is really a question about like the linebackers they have like behind him. Can Tyreek Maddox-Williams or any like undrafted free agents or guys really push him, or does the coaching staff really believe that much in Ogbongbemiga himself? I don't really know the answer, but I'd say he's probably pretty safe at this point.
Yeah, I think he'll make the roster. We had heard that the coaching staff was really high on him, and I was told like point blank that he was in the running for the starting spot. Then they signed Troy Reeder and Kyle Van Noy, so I don't know if that necessarily changed, but he was pretty clearly the favorite over Nick Neiman for linebacker 4 last year. So I wouldn't expect that to change unless he gets injured or unless he just kind of flounders his opportunity.
Thank you to the Chargers, by the way, for listing Morgan Fox as a defensive lineman while every website imaginable lists him at edge. Thank you for that.
Yeah. There's a lot of that. All right, the last one that I want to talk about is how does this staff and how does Khalil Mack in particular decrease the amount of double teams and triple teams that are thrown Joey Bosa's way? Because I think we heard, that was a lot of the selling point of Brandon Staley's, defensive plan was that he was going to free up Joey Bosa to do a lot more things. And some of that came to fruition. I think, he was able to rush against guards quite a bit more often, as opposed to what Gus Bradley did, who, as we know, very simple. He's going to line up at left defensive end. He's going to rush against tackles. There's not going to be a whole lot of changes. So I think they did a decent enough job of mixing up where Joey would rush from. But, you're talking about a 24% double team rate last year, which I think was second only behind Myles Garrett among qualified edge rushers, which Myles Garrett, that's another one where he just lines up against the left tackle and he just rushes. So it's a little easier to double team from that spot. But, we need to see that double team rate come down by, I think, at least 5% for Joey to really reach his sack potential. And that's a big deal in terms of where he stands around the league, in terms of him maybe challenging for a first team All-Pro ballot or a second team All-Pro ballot or defensive player of the year, because he's never really been, a 15, 16, 17 sack kind of player. But in this defense with this defensive line, I think he has the potential to get there if they can, get that double team rate down to 16, 17, 18% this year.
Yeah, I'd love to know how much of that will be manufactured or how much of it is just natural. Like, will him having better players, I'll let Jerry Tillery next to him, does that immediately just free him up? Does that make it, well, he might still have Jerry Tillery next to him. But like, does he naturally, because of the other players like Khalil Mack, Sebastian Joseph Day, whatever, does that make him freed up? Do they involve defensive backs with this? I don't recall if Joey Bosa he wasn't on the field when Adderley and James both blitzed because he left pretty early that game. But I'm curious how they would
against the Bengals.
Yeah.
No, he was out at that point.
Yes, I'm really curious how they use those defensive backs, and maybe Troy Reeder is part of the blitz package. But you have an athlete in JT Woods, either to play deep or to blitz, and this year Adderley can move up or whatever. You have Jasir Taylor. You do have a lot of guys who can do a lot of this, incredible work as athletes and blitzing the passer. So I really think that's something that Jasir Taylor did quite a bit and did very well. It's a very standout trait for what he did in college, and I'm curious if that continues.
Yeah, for me, they have huge upgrades at edge, right? We're going from Kyler Fackrell and Uchenna Nwosu to Kyle Van Noy and Khalil Mack, right? Like, that, to me, is like, at that point, Joey Bosa is going to be freed up, not to mention they obviously upgraded the interior. Now, does that come to a fault? And do you have to get more creative if Khalil Mack gets hurt? Sure. But, I mean, you would have to do that, I guess, anyway, even if Uchenna Nwosu got hurt, for example, last year. So for me, I think it's just all about the upgrades that they made over the offseason, how much they end up panning out. But, I mean, on paper, Joey Bosa should be freed up a lot more than he was, even compared to last season. So we'll see how that goes. I guess I will be curious to see, how much they want to bring, Derwin James, Drew Tranquil, some of those guys into, blitzing and rushing the passer. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see. But I think just naturally on its own, kind of like you guys have said, just because of the upgrade of talent, I mean, they should be able to free up Joey Bosa. And if they're not, even after adding Khalil Mack and Kyle Van Noy, it's kind of a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I did a video on the pass rush for, our YouTube members and patrons earlier in the offseason. And, the upgrades in the pass rush are definitely significant, but I still think they need to obviously get creative and mix and match packages and stunts like we were talking about. Because if Joey can get his double team rate down to 15%, like 8% is a huge change.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're talking about, double team percentage of 15% for Joey Bosa, I think you could talk about, 16 sack kind of season, and maybe he gets up to 90, 100 pressures, because I'm telling you, like, that man is so underrated in general around the country and around the league. And, I think PFF really kind of lowballed him quite a bit in terms of the pressures and sacks last year. But he's just so technically refined and just gives tackles hell every single week. Very similar to like what Keenan Allen does to defensive backs, although Joey obviously a bit more of an explosive athlete, right? But I think Joey's potential this year is an underrated storyline from, kind of like an outsider's perspective this season.
Yeah, that's a really good call. I would love to see him succeed. Obviously I want Herbert to win, I want Allen to win, but after Keenan Allen, it's really Joey Bosa. The guy's been through shit, like some bad coaches, this guy was, I don't remember if he won a national championship at Ohio State, but like
he did, yeah.
A good program, great coach. No, I'm kidding. Was that Urban still? I don't recall.
That was Urban still.
Neat.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a total piece of shit at that time. We can say
no, he was still a total piece of shit. You guys just ignored it.
Fair. Fair.
Yeah, I would love for him to do well, because it was very frustrating watching him against the Patriots get triple teamed, 15% of the time. It's like, come on, what are we doing here? Somebody step up, and hopefully his teammates do.
Yeah. I hope that they do get more creative, but I guess it's just like they don't necessarily need to, hopefully.
Sure.
And that's also just monitoring both of Joey Bosa's health, obviously his history of concussions, and Khalil Mack's as well, given what happened last season. So I guess I'll be interested to see, like, obviously this is kind of just a depth chart thing, but like how many, like, sort of what is their plan B, I guess, if those guys do go down. Does it involve just like sticking Kyle Van Noy in there? Does it, involve bringing up guys like Derwin and Drew to kind of like make plays in their place and manufacture some pressure? So that I think would be interesting, but that's more of like what do you kind of do in like a preseason scenario? That I guess would kind of be one of the more interesting things to watch in the preseason, when Joey and Khalil obviously aren't going to be playing.
I mean, to me, if either of those two get injured, you're looking at Kyle Van Noy as a full-time edge rusher. Like, you're not even putting him at linebacker at all at that point.
I'd agree.
Probably, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll move on specifically to some underrated Chargers at this point. I've talked a lot about Nasir Adderley, so if you guys want to talk about him, you can. But I think he deserves a mention. But my first player that I wanted to talk about here is actually Jalen Guyton. And a few weeks back, I saw some people talking about him online and how he's trash and how he just like doesn't bring anything to the team and like all this. And like, that's the thing. So many people in today's world live in he's elite or he's trash. And I just don't think that's very fair when you're talking about a 53-man roster. And so I don't think Jalen Guyton by any means is like a great player, but I think he's very successful in the role that he has on this team. And so I went and looked over the last 2 years, just kind of who each team's third wide receiver was, how many targets did they have, how many yards, how many touchdowns, how successful were they? And obviously there are certain teams where you're talking about like an Antonio Brown person as your wide receiver 3, or the 2020 Panthers with Curtis Samuel as your wide receiver 3. Like those teams probably have a higher success rate of that point. But I wanted to look at this and see where Jalen Guyton stacked up, and essentially like the bar that you're looking at to see if your wide receiver 3 is a good wide receiver 3. Is he a reliable wide receiver? Wide receiver 3 is right about 500 yards receiving, and Jalen Guyton had 511 in 2020 and 448 in 2021. So I think for the player that he is, he's a very useful speedster player. And by no means is he like the worst wide receiver 3 in the world. I mean, you're talking about the Tennessee Titans in 2020 had Adam Humphries, 224 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Houston Texans in 2021, Danny Amendola, 243 yards and 1 touchdown.
Texans.
Oh, yeah. God. I mean, the Jaguars last year, Tavon Austin was their wide receiver 3 with 211 yards and 1 touchdown. The Jets, Braxton Berrios, 37 catches, 390 yards and 2 touchdowns. Isaiah Ford on the Miami Dolphins in 2020, or Albert Wilson on the Dolphins in 2021. So by no means is Jalen Guyton like a great player, but I think he's a solid wide receiver 3 option. I also think he's going to be replaced this year a little bit with Josh Palmer. But Jalen Guyton to me is someone that is absolutely underrated by Chargers fans.
Yeah, I love that. You're absolutely right with the trash talk with Jalen Guyton, his hands being bellic and all that. Like, sure, like you said, he's not a great player, but he's a solid role player for what he does. And that if he continues his trajectory, he's going to get a nice contract. He's going to be pretty good for the Chargers this year, unless they completely phase him out for Josh Palmer. But I definitely have a soft spot for Jalen Guyton. And look, I think until the last week of the season, I believe Jalen Guyton had more 4th down targets than Mike Williams. There was like a lot of trust that Herbert had in Jalen Guyton. It just happened to be that final game against the Raiders. They spammed Mike Williams, but he was really, a factor for them. And Justin Herbert really taking that next step forward in the second half of the year, partially because he was targeting Jalen Guyton. We don't have that play against the Giants without Jalen Guyton. We don't have him, mossing Jesse Bates without Jalen Guyton. There are plays, a certain level of comfort that Herbert started to reach, throwing just a little bit deeper or just taking those chances. And that was partially because of Jalen Guyton. So yeah, I absolutely agree he's an underrated player. And I don't need Chargers fans to think he's the wide receiver 2, or that he's one of the best receivers on the team or whatever. Not even the best wide receiver 3 of the Telesco era. I don't think any of us even drafted him, but he's a good player. Like, he's a solid player for his role. And I do wish he got more appreciation.
Actually, I drafted Jalen Guyton as
I was going to say, I feel like
I forgot you drafted 72 wide receivers.
Yeah, my 72 wide receiver team. So you guys had to settle for Eddie Royal. I think Jalen Guyton is underrated, especially considering the improvements he made last year. Of course, there's moments like the drop touchdown in the Kansas City game, and you can point to some of the drops here and there. But much improved as a blocker. I think much improved as a route runner. I mean, compared to 2020, I think he was definitely a more multi-dimensional receiver, if you want to say that. I don't know if he's wide receiver 3A or 3B. That's like a whole thing that's going to play out during the season as well. But I think Jalen Guyton is certainly underrated. I'm going to go with an underrated name. I'm going to say Drew Tranquil, the David Letterman of our time. He through 10 games last year, he was the only linebacker we were comfortable playing at all. I just looked up Drew Tranquil on Twitter just because I was curious to see things that were being said about him. And Steven has a tweet from September 28th, 2021 that says, Drew Tranquil should not come off the field like ever. 100% snaps, please. That was how we felt. I mean, all through October. And then he got hurt, right? Obviously, Kenneth Murray gets hurt too. And if you just want some numbers, Drew Tranquil through the first 10 games or so, Drew Tranquil actually was 10th in the league at one point in defense grade, 10th in pass rush amongst linebackers as well, 15th in coverage, 16th in run defense about halfway through last year. So, I mean, Tranquil, we've talked about using him in blitz packages as well. easily the best coverage linebacker on the team, kind of by default. I think sometimes we don't know how important he is because we don't totally know what like the coaching staff's plan is at the linebacker group and how he's going to be here long term or whether he won't, given how the Chargers kind of don't value linebackers. But in the interim, especially with Kenneth Murray's injury, especially with not a whole lot of linebacker depth aside from Kyle Van Noy, who's also splitting time at edge, I think Drew Tranquill becomes one of the most pivotal players of 2022 if the Chargers are to make strides in the linebacker room, especially given, how ambiguous the Kenneth Murray situation is, and how much that is up in the air because of injuries. So I know we don't talk about him as like an elite player, and I don't believe he is an elite player, but certainly of the Chargers linebackers, he's easily the best one and has consistently been the most reliable.
Yeah, I've gained a real appreciation for Drew Tranquill as a blitzer and a pass rusher in studying him over the first, about 9 games into last season. And I think obviously there was, the sack that he created against Patrick Mahomes in week 2. But, I just finished up the Steelers game from last year, and they don't win that game without Drew Tranquill, the pass rusher, and what he was able to do to free up other opportunities. And he really worked Najee Harris in some blitz pickups. There was also another play where he beat, I forget the name of their left guard. I want to say it's like Meg or Haig or something like that. But, they put Drew Tranquill, Joey Bosa, and Uchenna Nwosu all next to each other off of the left side of the offensive line. And Tranquill beat this left guard relatively easily. It didn't result in a sack because Najee Harris kind of came over and helped him out, but it freed up Uchenna Nwosu to get this sack and actually caused a fumble. So I've gained a real appreciation for Tranquill as a blitzer. I think he's comfortably their best linebacker this year heading into the season. And very hopeful that he is their linebacker 1 because I can't do a Troy Reeder linebacker 1 or Kenneth Murray linebacker 1 season. So hopefully that tweet from last year rings true this year with Drew Tranquill.
So my underrated guy was going to be Troy Reeder because we can talk about it now. Do you actually think Drew Tranquill is starting over Troy Reeder? Like, I'm not that we want or don't want that to happen, but Eric Banks, I will say that until Staley is fired. Like, Eric Banks was
that's true.
Like, so do we actually think that Drew Tranquill is the starter, especially because last year they had him as LB3, which I guess makes sense with Murray and White, but they didn't have him as the starter last year. Does Reeder start over him this year?
Oh man, if they start Troy Reeder over Drew Tranquill, I'm going to be so disappointed.
Staley wants his guys on his defense, man. And
well, I hope when Brandon Staley came on the podcast, I haven't listened to it, but I hope Drew Tranquill sweetened him up so that we get some Drew Tranquill linebacker 1 over Reeder linebacker 1. Because if you watched Reeder film from last year, it's not pretty.
I'd be okay with Troy Reeder taking a little bit more of the run defense snaps from Tranquill.
Okay.
I think Reeder is maybe slightly better than Tranquill at just diagnosing traffic and getting to the ball in that sense. And I think that's a fair comment, but then you're also are you doing Troy Reeder and Kenneth Murray, or are you doing, Reeder and Tranquill? I think for me, Tranquill is just the most even keel player who can play good against the run, play good against the pass, rush the passer. I think he just gives you the most well-balanced player there, which is why I think he should be their linebacker 1.
Yeah, I also feel like the Chargers are going to be in a lot of games where teams have to throw to beat them. There's going to be a lot of shootouts. Particularly this year compared to last year, where the run defense was just oh, you can have Rex Burkhead and he'll have 200 yards. Hopefully it's not that way this year, and I think you can project that with how the Chargers are going to be scoring with Justin Herbert. Teams are going to have to throw against them, I think, more so, and that would certainly lean towards more Drew Tranquill. I would recommend for your safety and your well-being that you do not watch any Troy Reeder pass coverage film.
Yeah, it's not pretty. Tyler, did you have another underrated player you want to talk about besides Troy Reeder?
Yeah. If I'm the before picture to his after, Xander Horvath. as the underrated player, which doesn't. He'll have a role as is, but watching again, I've been watching Mike Williams, Keenan Allen. It's so apparent to me that Steven Anderson was such an integral part of this offense, and that honestly, they probably should have just re-signed him because he's so good. And there were very many instances where they needed a touchdown, a screen, some sort of kind of trickery in their offense. And Steven Anderson was a part of that. And now he's gone. So does Xander Horvath take up that role? I think if they want to have the same offense they did last year, which was very, I'm not going to say productive, but it was efficient. It worked very well when Steven Anderson touched the ball. Xander Horvath has to come into his own and be that weapon for them as well. Like, you're not just being Xander Horvath. To me, you also have to be Xander Horvath, who is showing to be at least Steven Anderson's level last year, if not better. If you regress, or if you have a player in Xander Horvath, if that's his role, I suppose we don't know his role yet, but if that is kind of his role, I would hate to see them regress because they got rid of Steven Anderson for the cheap and they got Horvath and he wasn't that good. There's a lot to this offense that involves Steven Anderson. Particularly, we saw that against the Eagles. And I hope that Horvath can replicate some of that. And we'll find out pretty soon what his role is. So, between that, his role maybe as a rusher, his role in short yardage situations, as a blocker on special teams, I think that, they drafted him because they believed in something that he had. Maybe it's just his RAS score. Maybe it's just his body physique. But they believe in him, I think. And I want to see that pay off on the field this year.
Yeah, I think if you are convincing yourself in like Horvath's potential over Steven Anderson, I think the athleticism is right there. Maybe they think that that's a way to kind of hunt some more, explosive plays with somebody who's a bit of a better athlete, maybe get him involved in the screen game, maybe hand the ball off to him or Gerald Everett. So I'm really excited to see what they do in general with like the tight end room because we all figured, Jared Cook was going to come in and he was going to be a target hog in that room. Donald Parham maybe takes a step forward, and he did. Obviously, the season didn't end the way that we all wanted.
Sure.
Trey McKitty as your blocker, but now we're hearing from Daniel Popper and others that Trey McKitty is kind of taking a step forward with his body, with his route running. Donald Parham, of course, continues to improve. You had Gerald Everett, you had Xander Horvath. So I'm just so excited to see all of this come to fruition.
I'll be curious in a way to see how they really view Horvath because I feel like our perception of him is obviously, they used the draft pick on him. Granted, again, it was like their last pick in a draft where they did have multiple, 6th-round picks, right?
Or did they? 7th,
yeah. 6th and 7th round picks. So I almost feel like they value him a little less than maybe we think, right? And we kind of talk ourselves into like, okay, well, they'll use him as a runner in some situations. They'll use him here at tight end as a pass catcher. But it's like, there's also a team that had Gabe Neighbors as like a healthy scratch for half the year, right? And does that say more about Gabe Neighbors or does that say more about how they view fullbacks in general? Like, I don't know. That's something that's going to be tested, I think, through training camp, through the preseason, and, whether or not they end up using one or either of these fullbacks during the course of the regular season. So I almost feel like Horvath is kind of overrated because we don't really know what the coaching staff, or not that he's overrated as a player, but what the coaching staff's perception of him might be a little bit overrated. I mean, we did spend 10 minutes of one final podcast just looking at a picture of him shirtless. So
we can do it again.
I wouldn't mind it. Bring it, roll the tape. But at the same time, I do feel like when we talk about Horvath, I want to see, I guess, what the concrete plan is to use him. Obviously we could talk about him, sort of being that multi-dimensional fullback weapon, but it's also like, do they want to use a fullback, right? Do they really want to incorporate that into their offense? And is Neighbors really as out the door as we think he is now? Obviously, Neighbors is Justin Herbert's best buddy. So I do think there is some ambiguity to like Horvath hype and how much of that ends up being real. I don't know.
Yeah, lots of Xander Horvath talk today. So a couple people mentioning some other names here. So I'll throw one more out. And that's going to be Austin Johnson. Of course, I've talked about him, talked about him on the trade deadline. And obviously we did a lot of work with free agency. But I think he's a a very solid addition, and I think there's an argument to be had that he's one potentially this year's Matt Filer, where he not necessarily an elite player, but just comes in and stabilizes a position and brings a lot of value to this defensive line and to this team overall. And so I loved going back and watching him a few weeks back and looking at his PFF profile and things like that. So I mean, his grades are not great, but I mean, he had 34 run stops, which was tied for 5th most in the league. His run stop percentage of 10.4 was 11th most in league, right next to Foluron Fatukasi, who just got a big deal, right next to Quinnen Williams, Lawrence Guy, Christian Wilkins, players who are kind of universally regarded as like top tier run defenders. His total run stop was tied with Zach Sealer. It was tied with Jeffrey Simmons. It was 2 more than Cameron Hayward. So I'm really excited about Austin Johnson. I don't think his addition is getting enough love either this offseason.
Yeah, it's definitely a boring ass position to talk about, but I can't wait to watch him on the field. No one's going to talk about him in training camp. Like nobody talks about anybody who's in the middle of the line that half the beat reporters aren't paying attention to anyway. So yeah, I think he'll definitely be an underrated player in training camp and during the season.
I don't know. For being in the middle of the line, we talk about Jerry Tillery quite a lot.
That's because he's not in the middle of the line.
That's because he's not 7 yards
that way. Yeah. I set him up and he hits him down.
Well done. Either of you have another underrated player you wanted to highlight here?
Not unless there's a move from Matt Filer to right tackle. Otherwise, I mean, it could be one of those 2 guards. I'd love to see them take their job, but I'd love to say Braden Fajoko, but I don't think he's going to make the team, unfortunately.
Sad face.
Yeah.
Alex, anyone?
I think we've kind of named all the guys. Does anyone want to be on Roundtree as underrated island? I don't really want to be there, so I think we kind of went through all the guys already.
No, I would quit that challenge.
There's definitely an island for Roundtree, and there's definitely an island for Easton Stick. A lot of people think that those 2 players are underrated. So
yeah, well, maybe we'll get to them as our overrated episode if we do one of those. But
there we go. So a couple people mentioned Zion, of course. Zion's not underrated on this show, I can tell you that much. Mentions for Josh Palmer, Bryce Callahan. Bryce Callahan is very I think it's a really good call. Really, the biggest thing there is, can he stay healthy or not?
Yeah.
When he's been on the field, he's been very good.
Jasir Taylor mentioned. I like that one. I'm a little curious about Dean Leonard. I don't know if he's underrated this year because I don't really know if he's making the roster, but if he does, and if he does hang in there and stick in there as a decent outside corner, Michael Davis is gone next year. It'd be nice to have some sort of developmental guy on your roster that you have some faith in. So definitely be watching his development for sure when he's not covering guys who are being thrown to by Easton Stick.
Yeah, I'd like to see what they think of Dean Leonard, I guess, and whether or not that's enough to like bump someone like a Tavon Campbell, right? I mean, who's effectively kind of their CB like 5 now. Do they kind of view maybe that last spot coming down to like him, Dean Leonard, Keemon Hall, some of those guys? So I guess that'll be the interesting thing to watch in training camp.
Yeah, and as Thomas points out, that could be an underrated storyline in and of itself. Tavon Campbell versus the 2 rookies. So I think it's more specifically Campbell versus Dean Leonard, like Tyler is mentioning, because I feel like Jasir and Keemon Hall have the 2 similar skill sets, and then Campbell and Dean Leonard have similar skill sets. Yeah. And I know people really like to shit on Tavon Campbell, but I mean, he was good when he was not the cornerback 1. Like when he was cornerback 3, he was a good player in that role. There were so many moving parts in that secondary, and then he ended up taking number 1 snaps against Devontae Smith and Justin Jefferson, and that would have been Deontay Johnson. So it was just kind of a mess in the middle of the season.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of, do you want kind of that more developmental guy like Tyler's talking about, someone who's kind of young, like a Dean Leonard, or do you want, for a team that I guess is supposed to be contending for the playoffs and Super Bowl, someone who's kind of done it before, as a depth cornerback, and can kind of, field that spot in the rotation if he's asked to do so. Even though, you're not developing Devon Campbell, he's 30. Right? So I think that's, which I couldn't believe he's 30, but yeah, that's going to be the interesting thing, I think, to watch with, whether they take Dean Leonard on the practice squad or whether they put him on, the active roster. And that's obviously in flux from week to week too, with, injuries and such.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed the underrated talk. So on Sunday, we're going to talk about the most exciting or intriguing training camp battles. So if we didn't cover somebody that you hoped we would cover tonight, we're hopefully going to cover them on Sunday. And then we're officially in training camp week. So if you missed it, Tyler's going to be kind of our man on the ground for the most part this year. We'll see if I'm able to make it out, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So excited that football is back. It's that time of year where we get a lot more football content than usual. So stay subbed, stay subbed on YouTube and audio podcast platforms. Make sure you're following all three of our Twitter pages, and Arjun as well as Maddie. Tyler, any final thoughts before we head out for the evening?
Thank God. I don't know if people wanted to hear my running back rankings. I can display. I freaking statistically ranked like 50 running backs, and we're not gonna get to it, but it's okay. I'm happy that football is back because, I started to feel it after a while. And I think even our audience felt it. I saw a couple of comments like, "Please God, let the season start so we don't have to watch this stuff anymore." So can't wait to get to the season, and it's fun. It's training camp and the preseason. We're all winners. We're all really good, and these players are showing out. And then, Chargers fans know the rest. So hopefully it's different this year.
Yep.
Obviously, if you are kind of on the fence about going to training camp, I would strongly encourage you to get off that fence and make it up for a weekend of practice or something like that. It's just such a unique experience as a football fan, being able to be up close and personal with them. So, Tyler, any final thoughts? Thank God. Yeah, couldn't have said that any better, man. I really appreciate that. Thank you guys for joining us today. Thank you for the comments, and we'll see you guys next time.